Welcome to Fireside Philosophy. This is the show where we're going to dive deep into philosophical topics right by our nice fireplace here. Today, I'm joined with Mr. Regalbuto. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. How are you doing today, Derek?
I'm doing well as well. I cannot wait to talk about the meaning of life with you today.
I am very excited about it.
Yeah, I've been
Definitely
very much
in my wheelhouse.
looking forward to starting up the show. It's the first episode. I can't wait to see how it goes. Basically, we're just talking about philosophical topics, and we want to make sure that gets integrated into your daily life. Very important that you're regularly questioning things and really getting into that deep thought. So this is about encouraging that and sharing it with people.
I completely agree with that, and we were saying before, it's something that a lot of people really don't have time for.
Yeah.
These days, to sit down and to reflect, and what we gain from that reflection.
Yeah.
It could be potentially so great for us.
Right.
In so many ways.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's so hard to say that I'm just going to set aside time for it. But once you do it, it's like I had to do that.
You gotta set aside the time. Absolutely.
So today we're talking about the meaning of life.
Okay.
All right. Very deep topic to go into for the first episode, but I wanted to come out of the gate strong, and really get into it. So
cool.
I guess we're just going to kind of talk about our ideas of the meaning, our purpose of life, and then we'll kind of just ponder them and see where the conversation takes us.
Absolutely.
So why don't you start us off?
Okay, well, the first thing I think of, I always go back to Socrates, and I think of the idea of him saying, the unexamined life is not worth living.
Love that quote.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And you think about it, it's not that your life is so terrible if it's not examined, but the fact is that you assign it that value in the examination.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think when we say, the meaning of life, the first thing that comes to mind for me is a bunch of questions. That's philosophy, right?
Right.
We ask questions. So I say to myself, number one, how do we define meaning?
Right.
Right? And then we have to think, is it that we assign meaning? Is it that we discover some meaning that is a priori, like already exists?
Right, like predetermined, yeah.
Somehow or another. And then when we think about that meaning, is it meaning for the individual solely? Is it that subjective or relative, which it is on some level? And is it something that's human? Is it this human meaning that exceeds the individual?
Yeah, because there's almost like a societal, you could take it in like a societal meaning sense. So many people may think, treat life as a checklist, get married, get a job, get a house,
Right.
And I don't feel like that's really what it's about. I don't think the meaning is there. I tend to think it's more about getting that feeling of happiness and satisfaction. I think the pursuit of happiness is at the center of the meaning. I feel like we get these feelings of happiness for a reason, and I feel like that's what we're meant to chase. I feel like that's the meaning. And in doing that, you oftentimes will help other people. That makes you feel good. And do what you love, which can be beneficial to society as well. So that's kind of where my ideas are on that.
I agree. I agree with that. And there's also a flip side to that too.
Of course.
When you think about human experience, and then you think about the idea of, that truth could be painful in some ways too.
Yeah.
We try. I think the idea is that we try to create order from chaos. The universe is chaotic. We're a product of that chaos.
Yeah.
In that sense. And what we try to do is we try to order our lives. In ordering our lives, we give ourselves that structure, and we give ourselves purpose. So the meaning becomes purpose.
Yeah.
Full.
In
some ways,
in that
sense. And of course, the ultimate desire, I think, is to find happiness.
Right. To get that feeling.
To get that feeling. To have that. And when you examine what's before you, and I think you take the good, the bad, everything in between, right? And you say to yourself, well, what value does each have for me? And if it's bad, then how can I change that?
Right.
Right? And if it's good, how can I appreciate it for one thing?
Yeah.
And how can I make it better?
Make sure it stays.
Make sure it stays. Is it lasting? Is it fleeting?
Right.
Or what do we do with it at that point, right?
Yeah.
It's almost something that we take inside of ourselves, and we could benefit personally on that level.
Yeah.
All right. So, but the assigning meaning in that sense, then it almost leads to, like, I'm seeing a double here. Like, I'm seeing like a slash.
Sure.
Meaning slash truth.
Right. Yeah.
You know, meaning slash truth. Because when you really think about it, what does every human want to know? They the story of humanity. I'm born. Oh my God, what's going on? What am I doing here?
Right.
And then we might figure it out. We might not.
Yeah.
We've always wanted to know, you know, what we're doing, what our purpose is, why are we here, where are we? You know, we're on this ball, right?
Yeah.
We're on this ball in the middle of infinity.
Right.
And we seem to be alone.
Yeah.
We seem to be alone. So that right there
Like,
has got to have everybody questioning.
Why are we alone? Where's
Right,
everyone
exactly,
else? You know.
Right. I mean, if you're not questioning at that point.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
Absolutely.
There's just so many different angles you can take at it too. You know, some people might interpret the meaning of life as, you know, success and, you know, being financially successful or professionally successful. But if we go back to the happiness thing, I feel like there are a lot of people who are super happy that aren't necessarily fully financially successful, and there's some people that are very financially successful that don't find that happiness.
And it might not make them happy.
Right. So if that doesn't make you happy, is that really the point? Is that really like the meaning, to, you know, get all that material things just to not have the feelings that go along with it?
Absolutely.
So it's really hard to determine.
Right. It is difficult to determine, and that's the part, I think, that in a more subjective way, I think you could make those personal determinations. But we always have to be careful of deceiving ourselves too.
Right.
You know, because when we want something and we want joy and we want happiness, you know, sometimes we could lie to ourselves.
Right.
To make ourselves feel better about those things. And that's why I think that you have to add that slash truth.
Yeah.
In that sense, because what is true?
Yeah.
Right. What is true? You know, and is that truth a common truth, a common human truth? I mean, as far as when you think in existential terms.
Right.
So when you think existentially, then we're talking about truth that is human.
Yeah.
Right. But when you think about the idea of our lives and just where we are in the moment and reflecting on what we can do and how we've been doing things and how we would like to feel, then that becomes more personal.
Yeah, and I think that kind of feeds into that, you know, the meaning of life is whatever you ascribe it to be.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Maybe the
like
meaning, that's exactly what I was referencing, yeah. Maybe that's kind of the point, you know, like the meaning wherever you are in your life, it could maybe even change the meaning of life throughout your life.
Absolutely.
You know? Life is something that's constantly changing, so who's to say the meaning of it isn't changing?
Oh, the meaning would definitely change.
Yeah.
That's the constant, isn't it?
Right.
Change is the constant.
For sure.
So it's almost like when you think of this, it's almost like we're still on this rolling ball of
Yeah,
chaos.
yeah.
You know what I mean? In some ways, with this constant change, things constantly changing, and so making sense of that sometimes is sort of pondering its meaning as well.
Right.
You know,
right.
What do we gauge from those changes, and what do we gain from understanding them or assessing them?
Right. Or how they affect us.
Or how they affect us, yeah. And the interesting thing is that we're sort of tied together in some way too, because, and that's why I always think about the subjective and the objective. I think about the personal and that sort of gestalt of humanity in that sense. Because we're sort of inextricably woven together here. Yeah. In some ways, and it's almost like where you have like this. I always imagine like the pinball games or the games with the balls where a ball rolls, and it hits something, and that's going to move. Right. And then it's going to hit something, and that's going to move. Yeah. And that's going to move. You know, so we sort of influence each other in that way. Yeah. And that's why it's so important to think about that idea for meaning. And what would we do? How would we assess meaning? How would we gain that meaning? I think we'd have to learn. We'd have to open up and want to learn. Because I would argue that life is for learning. Yeah. What do you do
Maybe
from
that's
the day you're
meaning,
born
you know?
to the day you die? You can always learn. Right. You know? Yeah,
I agree. I think that's, very important. If you're not learning, if you're not gaining new information as you're going along life, the unexamined life, what's the point, Exactly. similar to that thought process there. It's like maybe learning is why we do what we do. Learning from the past, learning from, things that have happened in our life as well as the lives of other people.
Yep.
And maybe someday, there'll be enough history that's examinable for people to make a better determination on what's going on here.
Absolutely.
But that would definitely be very interesting as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it's the idea of making that happen along the way, of examining those truths, examining that life along the way.
Right.
And it's interesting when you think about that, how common it may or may not be.
Yeah.
Right?
It might be an easy answer.
Right. It might be right. And it might be so simple that we can't see it.
Right.
But it might be so complex that it's way above us that we'll never get it.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, let's face it, if we, and I say this to my students all the time, if we knew everything, we wouldn't be human. We wouldn't be here.
Right.
And if we totally understood, so a part of that meaning is not sort of accessing.
Right. It's almost that ignorance.
Experience.
Ignorance is bliss in that sense.
Exactly. We don't necessarily always access that meaning.
Right.
But on another way of looking at it is that we can also sort of make meaning.
Right. I like that answer a lot.
By our actions, by our deeds, by our
Right.
connections, our thoughts, our speech.
Right.
We can make meaning. And in that assessment of the events, experience,
Right.
and then reflection upon that experience.
Yeah. And that, context is important.
Absolutely.
The meaning within each context. If something really bad is going on, maybe your meaning is to stop that, in that context, or to help, raise awareness against that, or something like that. That might be the most important meaning at the time. Something that's very important to happen, or something that does make you feel that good feeling of happiness. It's so hard to really nail down one thing.
Right.
Like we said, it's always changing. So
it always changes.
Context, could very well be changing the meaning. I think it does.
Yeah, and the context is also a part of that truth.
Right.
Right? It's a part of that truth that goes with the meaning. Because we can make meaning, and that's the scary part too, though.
Right.
Because we could make meaning, but that meaning could be entirely fictitious.
Right. Is that the true meaning, or
Right.
is that meaning that we think is the true meaning and that we're using to justify, an end?
Exactly. Because we do have these slips of mind and these flaws,
Yeah.
As human beings. And I think that's a part of the meaning.
Right.
Accessing, understanding those flaws, perhaps even overcoming them.
Yeah.
Overcoming those flaws might lead to more meaning, right? Or assessing meaning or accessing meaning in a different way.
Of course.
Which, of course, leads to truth.
Yeah. I think
That will change.
I definitely agree that truth and meaning are intertwined. I don't think you can really have one without the other there. If you determine a meaning for yourself and it is false, like maybe it's true to you though, and it's hard to
Right.
determine that, right? And sometimes, maybe you think you have a meaning, and then to what end is it justified to pursue that meaning,
Right.
I would be happy if I had $1 million. I can't just go steal $1 million, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
So-
Right. Right. I mean, the idea is that, and I always return to the concept of that relative truth.
Yes.
Versus a more absolute truth. I think that's the idea that we're discussing a little bit. Because that relative subjective truth, as people say, my truth.
Right.
My truth. But sometimes my truth is just my experience or my opinion.
Right.
In that case. And I would argue, when you think about the concept of truth as a part of that meaning, we have to ask the question again, is truth something that necessarily changes?
Right.
Does truth remain constant? Whereas meaning does not, and context does not
Right.
remain constant, because of the change factor.
Of course.
So we have to question, is there some type of underlying truth beyond all of that.
Yeah.
That remains constant, almost like this root from which these branches of meaning spring.
Yeah. I
Right?
like
this
that.
trunk, you know, in
Because
some ways.
if truth isn't absolute, then, you know, like we said earlier, that ball is always going to roll.
Right.
You know, and maybe it's not even rolling on anything. Now it's just in free fall because it has nothing to stand on, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Because if truth's moving too, that's like, you know, the ball's moving, but the ground's moving under it or something.
That's the goalpost moving.
Right? Yeah.
That's
yeah,
the goalpost moving.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So, in that case, I don't think if that is the case, I don't know that we'll ever, you know, nail down the meaning.
Yeah.
Because if all three variables there are always changing,
This is true.
it's always different.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of difficult.
And I mean, and you could also add the concept of ideals
Yeah.
and idealism to that. In other words, in light of everything that we see, for example, you know, you've got the idea of the Platonic ideal, where there's sort of world of ideals, these perfect versions of things
Right.
that don't necessarily exist on this plane, because when, like, for example, maybe we would imagine the perfect stool or the perfect chair, and when we go to create that, it's no longer perfect. It's now
Right.
subject to the ravages of time, or we can align it off a little bit
Right.
or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think that those things beyond our reach, and this is what I mean about moving the goalposts, like that's what I'm referring to, those things beyond our reach are what actually keep us striving.
Right.
And the more that we strive to attain these things, I think the more truth and the more meaning we produce
Yeah.
or create along the way.
I like that.
You know, like maybe it's something we make. Maybe we're the creators of that.
Right.
We set that truth in its place.
Yeah.
And maybe we don't realize our own potential
Right.
in that regard.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because if you know the full truth, you know, it's hard to, are you even going to be motivated to, you know, keep doing whatever you're doing, keep asking questions, keep, you know, obviously there's no questions left to ask. You know, if you know everything, you kind of become above human. And I think part of what makes us human is the ignorance, in that we don't know what the meaning is, that we have to sit here on this show and ponder the meaning, you know?
Exactly.
I think that's kind of the point.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that idea, it goes, again, we go back to Socrates from the Apology, and saying, well, Socrates is the wisest man in Athens, mostly because he knows what he doesn't know.
Right.
He knows that he knows nothing, right? And that would make him the wisest man in Athens. And I say the same thing to my students. It's a quote I use a lot.
I like that one.
And I think the exact translation that I had of it was, he among you is wisest, who like Socrates knows in truth his wisdom is worth nothing at all. So he would go around questioning these experts on the truth, on the real meaning. And he would ask them questions, basically, and say, you know, look, I know nothing. So you're going to tell me, you're a wise person. You are the perfect version of this. You are the expert. So I'm going to ask you all of these questions. And the more questions he asked people, they eventually began to stumble, like every human would.
Yeah.
You know, at some
I mean,
point.
eventually you get too far, and you know, you get to
Right.
questions they can't answer.
We reach a limit, yeah. We
Right.
rise to the level of our own incompetence in some ways too. You know what I mean? So we do reach that limit, and those folks, okay, who were the experts, didn't understand their limit. They didn't recognize their limit. Socrates made them recognize their limits. He made them recognize that they don't know as much as they think they do.
Yeah.
And rather than saying, wow, I really need to learn more,
Right.
they made them drink hemlock.
Yeah.
Yeah, they poisoned them. They executed him, basically corrupting the youth of Athens, things like that, called him a sophist and everything else. So when we think we know everything, we can't learn anything.
Right.
We can't grow. And we have to wait for someone to tell us things. And what happens when we don't believe it?
Right.
Right? I mean, that's the idea.
And I think that's where the meaning comes from, is that pursuit of finding the meaning in a way.
Yeah.
And, you know, that pursuit.
It's the chase.
Yeah, it is. I think that's, whether it's, you know, the chase of, you know, pursuit of happiness, whether it's the pursuit of knowledge, I think that the idea of humans not having and wanting and, you know, being curious and, you know, wanting to achieve things.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of the point. And even if it is something that doesn't really, in the end, matter, you know, say you want to get an Oscar. I'd like to get an Oscar, you know?
Sure.
So, like, sure, say I
Right.
want an Oscar, right? I don't see that as a predetermined, oh, you know what? His meaning is to get that Oscar, and that's the most important thing, you know?
Right.
That's a meaning that you set for yourself.
And you're more multifaceted than that, too. Right.
Yeah, right. There's more to it,
Right.
yeah, than, you know, just that one thing. But I think the pursuit, that chase to get things, that feeling that, you know, you're working towards something, and that there is meaning, you know,
Yeah.
that there is a reason why I'm doing all this, and I'm not just going through the motions here. I think that's kind of what's important.
Yeah, it really is true, and too, because I mean, you're born, and you're like a baby, and you're all like, "Oh, what's going on? Wow, right? I don't know what's happening here." And as you grow up, you're inculcated into society. You learn things, you're told things, and you come to accept them, you know, on some level. And then you find yourself at this point in life where you're independent. You know, you always want that independence growing up.
Sure.
And then you find you got this independence and you don't know what to do with it.
Right.
Right, at some point. And but it's through that independence, it's through almost that falling off the cliff that we land somewhere.
Right.
In some cases, with meaning
Yeah.
and learning. And we don't know anything. And we don't know why we're here, and we don't know how we're here. And so that part of that meaning is assigning ourselves purpose.
Right.
But there's a caveat, I think, that goes with the assigning of purpose. Because we can give ourselves, I guess, all kinds of crazy purposes
Right.
that really don't lead anywhere, or are just sort of, I guess, ticking away the time.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Rather than using that time to create something
Yeah.
that's real, or access something
Right.
that's real.
Or leave something you can leave
Or
behind.
leave something.
And that's another
good point.
thing.
Yeah.
You know, at a certain age, you find out, you know, there's an end.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
part of the meaning too. Why do we do the things we do when we know there's a beginning and an end? You know, it is that journey to the end and what you do along the way, and all the meanings that you set between now and then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you want to avoid that sense of futility.
Right, yeah, you don't want to think about that all the time. And you don't
Right.
want to live like, well, it's all going to end someday, so it doesn't matter.
So why bother? Right,
Right,
exactly. Right.
And that shows that life does have meaning. The fact that we feel that way, the way that we're not just, oh, it's going to end, there's no point. You
I
know?
think that's an excellent point. Even if it's a meaning we don't understand.
Yes.
Because otherwise, if that were truly the case, not all of us would have that attitude.
Right.
Why bother? What's the point?
Yeah.
Right? Yet somehow, right, we do.
Somehow we get out of bed in the morning.
always
Somehow
do.
we go to school.
Right.
So-
right. We function.
Yeah,
We create. We
it
build.
happens.
We do these things. Right.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's an excellent.
At least we
point.
know there's a meaning there.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if we
At-
can't pin down exactly what
Right.
it is, we know life has
Absolutely.
meaning.
Yeah,
So-
absolutely. So it's that meaning, and then, like I said, you can think to yourself, well, this is my meaning, this is my truth, this is what I do, this is what I believe, this is what I've come to believe through my experience, right? Then you could turn around and say, okay, now how is that human?
Right.
Let's go even to the next level, so to speak, from the trees to the forest,
Sure.
right? In that case, and say, okay, so how is my personal experience a part of the human experience?
Yeah.
It might differ. There might be some shades of, meaning
Sure.
that are different in some ways. But at the same time, it is still all very human.
Yeah.
And the individuality, I think, is the really, really interesting part of that. Because each individual, we worry about relativity, I mean relativism, things like that, because if everything is relative, then nothing is real.
Right.
On one level. Do you
Sure.
know what I mean? If everything's okay, nothing's okay at the same time.
Right. If
you
everything's
know?
good, nothing's bad.
Exactly, exactly. So, I mean, when we think about that personal experience, that unique individuality, it would be interesting to consider how those individual pieces contribute to the greater whole.
Right.
You know, and what keeps us is almost like the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's like what keeps us sort of aside, what keeps us sort of separate in the little bubbles of truth, right? And that stops us from creating one bigger truth,
Right.
or realizing one bigger truth.
Yeah. And like you said, with, like purpose and whatnot, you want to leave something behind, and you want to, question and contribute, like you were saying, to the greater humanity.
Right.
So
right.
why do we, naturally praise people who do such big contributions? We naturally feel certain ways towards those people that, we like them.
Right.
Because of their contributions. And it almost feels like a subconscious thing, I've never met, let's say George Washington.
Right.
But I would praise him.
No, I'm kidding.
No, I know.
Right, of course, right.
Right. But, of course, I would admire someone like that who, was able to do what he did. And,
Absolutely.
Obviously everyone has their flaws, and, you accept that too. But it makes you think, we naturally look to these people that have made large contributions to, the way the world is now. And we look to them in many ways. So it's like, is that a part of it too? Are those people who have, found or felt meaning and kind of been able to pursue that more? But also, you can't just say that meaning's for other people. It's in yourself too.
Absolutely.
It's not just, I have to help X amount of people. I invented this thing that helped this many people. I win. It's not a game.
No, of course not.
So
right.
it's
right.
also about that meaning in yourself, and you being satisfied with that.
Absolutely,
So.
I agree with that. And as always, it leads to questions, right? It leads to questions. It makes me wonder. So imagine, okay, taking a person and not giving them any history of humanity, not giving them any influence. What meaning would they make? Because it makes me wonder, are we trying to recreate someone else's meaning on some level?
Right.
Or are we trying to create our own?
Yeah.
In that sense. And when we try to create our own, are we just going by like a model provided for us?
Right. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the checklist thing.
Right, right.
Get a house, get a job, checklist.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting concept because, early times, and even look at, other organisms that aren't humans, their meaning is to survive, and
they might not even know it.
Yeah.
Right.
They're just doing their thing, staying alive. And,
Yeah.
That's what life's all about. But now we're at this point where it's like, okay, we can stay alive, but now what?
Right.
Just like, anything else, once you get to what you're trying to do, like you were saying with independence, once you're independent, now what? Now we are able to consistently survive, and we're not, like fighting animals for our lives every day. We're not scavenging fruits from like the forest to survive.
Right.
And now what? Because we reach that.
Right.
So maybe every time you reach a meaning, it's like, what's the next meaning?
What's the next step?
What's the next meaning?
How do we get off that plateau?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely the way of looking at it too. And how do we connect that meaning to the larger human population?
Yeah.
In that case. We build this meaning in some ways, like building the tower, like I was saying before. Right.
Well, this was great. This was a great discussion. I had so much fun.
Awesome. It sounds like we're just getting started.
Yeah. Well, what a great episode. Thank you so much for being my first guest.
I
This was
appreciate
great.
you having me on. Thank you.
Yeah,
I love this too.
Sometime
It's
I'd
great.
love to have you back as well sometime.
Let me know anytime. I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Well, this was great. Thanks for
Awesome.
watching the first episode of Fireside Philosophy. I'll catch you on the next one. Thank you.